Hello everyone, I'm Mayor Fitchett. I'm a policy analyst at NEA, and I've been leading on our work on Eco Plus response and engagement in line with a fair and affordable transition to net zero. I am delighted to welcome all of our fantastic panellists and guests to the third day of NEA's conference. The session is Transition to Net Zero, how can Eco 4 and Eco Plus help fuel-poor householders decarbonise their homes? And I just want to remind everyone that there is no Slido Q&A today, so it'll be just roaming mics. So if you want to ask questions, just put your hand up. So we're unfortunately nearly at the end of what's been a really fantastic conference. It's been brilliant to hear from so many speakers and to talk to people doing such fascinating and important work over the past few days. I hope you've all had a great conference and also had the chance to see old and new faces, and I hope you found it as insightful as I have. So I just wanted to start the session by providing a little bit of context. I want to take you back to basics by talking a little bit about the importance of helping fuel-poor households decarbonise their homes. It sounds obvious, but I think it's really worth unpacking. In the UK, we have some of Europe's coldest, leakiest, and least efficient housing stock, meaning we're one of the worst exposed to volatile energy prices. As is so often the case, the poorest and most vulnerable, i.e. those with the fewest protections, are hit the hardest by rising energy bills. The number of households in the UK in fuel poverty currently stands at 6.7 million, which is a figure I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, but that number is predicted to rise to as much as 8.4 million when the energy price guarantee is raised in April. So we're clearly talking about a significant proportion of the population here. Now, of course, the cheapest unit of energy is the one we don't use, so it's unsurprising that leaky, inefficient housing stock is having such a dramatic effect on fuel poverty levels. It's for this reason that we advocate a fabric-first approach, which prioritises addressing the components and materials of homes before changing heating systems or installing new technologies. The correlation between the quality of our housing stock and fuel poverty is clear. 20% of houses in the UK were built before 1919, and only 24% have been built since 1980. The picture's even worse in particular nations. So take Wales, for example, has some of the oldest and worst housing stock in the UK. As much as 63% of homes in Wales are rated EPCC or below. And it's no coincidence then that Wales experiences some of the highest levels of fuel poverty, with up to 45% of the Welsh population categorised as fuel poor. Now, I know it paints a simplistic picture, but I think it really does demonstrate the need for energy efficiency when looking at fuel poverty. And energy efficiency doesn't only address fuel poverty, it's also the key to building the UK's energy security and independence, and as a result of that, energy affordability. Efficient homes are also undoubtedly central to meeting our net zero targets. With the UK's homes responsible for approximately 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, and unfortunately progress here is stagnating, with little decline in those levels being seen since 2015. So we know that energy efficiency is important. I'm sure this will be a familiar argument to many of you, but I also want to talk about why it's imperative that fuel-poor, low-income and vulnerable households are placed centre and forefront of this transition, otherwise known as the worst first principle. Now, there's a moral argument for this. Low-income households are much more likely to occupy inefficient homes, meaning some pay a premium in thousands per year solely to keep warm. Improved energy efficiency should target these homes first in order to protect the most vulnerable against price spikes such as those seen over the past year. There's also a political argument. Polls indicate that policy must be seen to serve the needs of the most vulnerable in order to obtain public buy-in. And then there is an economic argument. Focusing decarbonisation measures on low-income households unlocks as much as 5.6 million in economic demand. This is because low-income households are likely to spend any additional money within the local economy, whereas wealthier households are much more likely to save or, for example, invest abroad. This means that extra money in the pockets of fuel-poor households is investment into local economies, and it is economic stimulation. As was discussed in yesterday's session, cold, damp and leaky homes are also a huge health risk, exacerbating and sparking an array of physical and mental health conditions and costing the NHS as much as an estimated 1.4 billion per year in England alone. Greater energy efficiency measures then are a happier, healthier population and a more productive workforce. The co-benefits go on, as could I, but I'll stop there. And if you do want to read any more about this, lots of these arguments were touched on by Chris Skidmore in his recent Net Zero review. And yet we know there are ongoing barriers to decarbonisation for fuel-poor homes. I'll shamelessly plug last year's fuel poverty monitor here. So we're here to talk about ECO, or Energy Company Obligation Schemes. They're the government's main tool for addressing energy efficiency in low-income households. The question is, are they addressing these barriers? In short, not entirely. Eco Plus is certainly welcome as an announcement for greater funding for smaller energy efficiency measures, particularly those not covered by Eco 4. But it was disappointing to see that government had chosen to target only 20% of eco funding at fuel-poor households. And there are certainly questions around whether this is the best way to maximise fuel poverty alleviation as per the UK's statutory fuel poverty targets. Given insufficient funding and the sheer scale of the problem, we've also called for the funding across 3 years of Eco Plus to be increased to £1 billion. Another significant barrier to decarbonisation for fuel-poor homes is household contributions. Amidst inflationary pressures, the rising prices of food and fuel, fewer and fewer households have any spare income to contribute to Eco Plus and Eco 4. One of the lessons that we learned from Eco 3 was that suppliers are likely to seek out customers who are able to contribute. And so introducing financial contributions is clearly steering eco schemes away from where they're most needed. But I'll stop there, having spoken to a few of our key points and policy recommendations around the decarbonisation of fuel-poor homes, and specifically how eco schemes can or aren't supporting this. I'd like to bring in some other perspectives. So NEA itself doesn't deliver through eco, but I share the stage today with some panellists who are much closer to delivery. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have Mark Dallen, who is Consortium and Stakeholder Manager at EDF. We have Kirsty Ford, who is Head of Scheme Delivery at OVO. We have Louise Shooter, Policy Manager at Energy UK, and then we have James Somerville, Policy and Partnerships Director at Agility Eco. So first, I will pass the stage to Mark, who will be providing us some detail on which measures under Eco 4 can be used to support decarbonisation in fuel-poor homes.
It's still good morning, so good morning everybody, just about. And thank you NEA for inviting me to talk about Eco 4. Eco 4 is quite a complex obligation. I think most people who are aware of working in Eco 4. Eco 3, we all thought that was complex, but now Eco 4's with us, been with us for 10 months now because it was launched in April last year. And I think a lot of us are still trying to get to grips with what the legislation really means and what we can and can't do on energy inefficient homes. So if the clicker works, it is just an overview here. I've got, I think, 5-6 minutes to talk about Eco 4. And if I was from Ofgem or Bays, you know, I could probably talk for about 2 hours and I still wouldn't be able to sort of turn every single page of the legislation. So what I'm going to do... Oh, yes. Thank you. So I'm not going to read out what's on the slide. I'll let you guys do that. But the obligation started April 2022 and it ends on the 31st of March 2026. So a 4-year obligation, which is good in a way because it gives us plenty of time to plan for measures that can be installed on scale, on communities. In particular, it's really good for working with local authorities. Up to 50% of the scheme can be actually delivered through EcoFlex. And that's a really good way of working with communities, with local authorities, I think, to deliver Eco 4 measures. The whole point of Eco 4 compared to previous obligations, it's the whole house approach. So you're not just doing individual cavity wall insulation measures, loft insulation measures. You're doing a project on these on some of these homes, and some of these homes are having 3, 4, even 5 measures installed under Eco 4. And it's very much, the whole house approach is very much fabric first. So if you're going to do heating, it's very important through the obligation that you do all the insulation measures that you can do first. The whole point again about Eco 4 is getting those worst performing homes in the country, England, Scotland and Wales, up to the minimum requirements as well for Eco 4. And that means that we're targeting, we can do D, E, F and G EPC ratings, but the targets we're set by Ofgem are for E, F and Gs mainly. I think 70% of our targets are for E, F and Gs. The rest are for those that are D rated. And we've got to get them up to at least 2 energy EPC bands, and that's called the minimum requirement. So if it's a D or an E rating, we've got to get it up to a C. If it's an F or a G, we've got to get it up to a D rating. And that means installing a number of measures. That's the main difference between Eco 4 and previous obligations. I'll point it this time. So again, I'm not going to read out all the measures that can be done because hopefully you can read it. Even those at the back, hopefully you can still read what's on the screen there. For private owner-occupied properties, most of the measures can be installed under Eco 4. There's uplifts as well if you're doing innovation. There are some innovation measures where they give you a 25% uplift on the score as well. I would say Eco 4, a lot of it is aimed at private tenure, so that's both private owned and private rented. So if I go on to the next slide. Private rented, again, most measures can be done under private rented. The only stipulation, of course, is that you have to get landlord consent. So we can't just go in and install measures on a private home, private rented home. And this can be quite challenging because quite often it's difficult to track down where the landlords are. We do lots of schemes in London, for instance, and I think up to 35% of the tenure in London is private rented. It's quite a high proportion. And quite a few of these landlords don't live in the country, they live abroad. So as much as we're trying really hard to do measures on these properties, without tracking down the landlord and getting their consent, it's very difficult. Social tenure, so again, we can still do measures on social tenure, so whether that's local authority, council owned or housing association. Not quite as many measures are applicable. We can see the little crosses next to the measure means you can't do that. But the thing to remember also is that I mentioned earlier, our targets set by Ofgem are for EPC ratings E, F and Gs. Any social property would automatically go into the band D or EPC D, which is the lower target. So as much as we like doing social schemes, because they're great, they're community schemes, we could do blocks of flats, we could do insulation, etc. It means the target we've got for those that's set by Ofgem is a lot lower than the ones for EPC ratings E, F and Gs. So when we choose to do community schemes in social housing, we have to be careful that they're not too big and fill our target too quickly. So that's things that energy companies have to be aware of. And these slides are available. If you do want to come and see the stand around the corner, I've got copies of these slides, or I think they're going to be distributed as well. But I have printed off some just in case you want to take some away with you. Eco 4 qualifying criteria. So yes, you have to be at EPC band E, F or G for that large target we've got. And again, this is the benefit criteria to qualify for Eco 4 funding. I think that's very similar to the previous obligations as well. I don't think it's changed that much. Then, this is the last slide. So those of you, local authorities, councils, you can qualify for Eco 4 funding through LA Flex, as we call it. You have to issue something called a statement of intent on your websites, and some local authorities have done that already. Others, I think, are holding back a bit and waiting to see what other local authorities do. I would encourage you to speak to energy companies. I mean, obviously, come and speak to EDF, but other energy companies are available as well. Some are here in the audience. So, and we are a friendly bunch. You know, as much as we're competitors, we all talk. We can't sort of say too much about rates and stuff like that, but we do talk about how we're doing in eco, and all of us are saying the same thing. It's tough because it's a much harder scheme to deliver now. Because you have to do multi-measures on properties, it's quite difficult to sometimes actually find where they are. But we would encourage any local authority to come and speak to us, find out how Eco 4 Flex works. Statement of intent, I think Ofgem have got like a template you can use to fill it in, which is really useful. Some local authorities look at what other local authorities have written on their statements of intents and just tweak theirs slightly. So again, I would encourage any local authority to get involved in eco because it's a long scheme. I know we've got LAD funding, social housing decarbonisation funding, but Eco 4 does last until March 2026, so lots of time to plan for community schemes. And that's the end of my presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was a really useful context setting about which measures are actually included under ECO. And Mark and I had a conversation yesterday about kind of how confusing it can be for suppliers and householders alike, and it is a bit of a minefield. So I think it's really useful to have that set out. And also good to touch on EcoFlex. We will be asking the audience a question about EcoFlex later. So yeah, great to get that in there. So great. Next, we're going to have Kirsty. So Kirsty's going to be looking at what is working for the transition to net zero in the context of Eco4 and Eco+. Thanks, Kirsty. I think, it's super important to touch on sort of striking that balance between speedy delivery and delivering good quality measures. And I know in the policy sphere, it's a sort of constant battle to encourage that quick rollout versus ensuring standards are at standard, essentially, when you're delivering an emergency service, as it is now. But yeah, particularly, as you've mentioned, schemes like ECO can be so disruptive. It sort of drives home the importance of the positive customer journey and managing expectations. So it was really good to hear some of those things that OVO are doing to smooth the transition. Just to let you all know, we've put a question on Slido, which is about the challenges when delivering Eco4. So if anyone has any experience with that, I'd encourage you to get on Slido and provide some answers. But I'll now pass over to Louise. So Louise will be talking about Energy UK's response to Eco4 and Eco+, and also about some of the additional support needed.
Thanks, Maya, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. So just a bit about Energy UK. We're not actually an energy supplier. We're a trade association in the energy industry, and we represent a range of businesses, from generators to suppliers to energy service providers, for example, who install charge points. So we really have that kind of system-wide perspective in a lot of our work, and including kind of looking at the role of Eco4 and Eco+ in leading the transition to a net zero power system. And so it's kind of really welcome to see the framing of this session today about looking at the role of these two schemes and ensuring that fuel-poor households are kind of leading that transition. And I'm probably going to echo a lot of what Kirsty and Mark have said about some of the things that we've kind of responded to in terms of Eco4 particularly. But I think from our perspective, it's kind of useful to think about the way that Eco4 and Eco+ in terms of their policy design can help contribute to building blocks for enabling a kind of broader group of consumers to be supported and kind of ramping up to that scale that we heard about, in the first session that's needed of around 1 million installs by 2028 a year. So in terms of, I think there's kind of 3 things that we've identified are really key in terms of looking at the way that Eco4 can really help to build that infrastructure to help us achieve more kind of EPC improvements across the consumer base and across all households of all tenures. So the first kind of aspect is relationships, and just to echo the call for kind of more, I guess, it would be really useful to have more dialogue with local authorities and kind of understanding what are the challenges that they're facing in engaging with Eco4. We know that there's obviously resource issues. We know that Eco4 is more complex for local authorities to engage with compared to Eco3. But in thinking about the role that local authorities are going to play as we kind of move towards a net zero power system, so whether that's through having that really kind of specialised and unique perspective about local communities, about who's in the private rented sector, about the different typologies of that building stock in that area, they provide really valuable insight that can ensure that Eco4 reaches people who need the support most. But also thinking about the role that they'll eventually play in installing more heat networks and that kind of energy infrastructure. So establishing that relationship through Eco4 between local authorities and the energy industry and consumers is going to be really helpful in accelerating the transition over the longer term. The second aspect kind of goes back to a conversation we had this morning about the role of EPCs. So as we heard, there's a requirement in Eco4 for households to be increased by 2 EPC ratings. But one of the challenges that we have at the moment is that when a heat pump is installed in a home, because of the current methodology behind the calculation to work out the EPC band rating, it actually results in a poorer outcome. So that approach is not really working at the moment with the Eco4 scheme design, and we really need to work with government to accelerate the review that they've got underway at the moment for that methodology and bring forward the methodology for existing buildings as well, which is slightly different. And then finally, we kind of see the consumer journey piece as, and sorry, just to say that I guess those changes to EPCs are going to be really, really vital for helping people who don't necessarily kind of falling into these schemes, but are struggling and they need help. So EPCs are going to equip people with the information they need to improve their home, but they're not currently fit for purpose. And so just finally, in terms of thinking about the consumer journey under Eco4 and Eco Plus, as Kirsty said, it's really vital that these two schemes work together. It shouldn't be the case that someone can't receive support under both schemes. Because of the example that Kirsty gave in the private rented sector, there's other scenarios where someone's circumstances might change. We've seen Eco4 as a commercial scheme, so whereas one provider might not make the project work in that home, maybe another could, but the fact that that household has potentially received Eco Plus funding shouldn't preclude them from having that additional support where it's needed as well. So there's kind of a few of these aspects, and as I said, that shout out for local authorities to come and speak to Energy UK and others about what we can do to kind of really build that relationship. And in thinking about kind of Eco4 and Eco Plus, it's Energy UK's view that these are kind of really key schemes in kind of helping to ensure that fuel poor households are really kind of fully funded to be involved in the transition. But we need to think about them as part of that wider policy framework to support the transition. So that includes things like better long-term regulation, to send a stronger signal to the market, fiscal incentives so that people are rewarded to have more energy efficient homes, and kind of building up that pipeline will really help stimulate more training and skills as well in the construction industry. And I just wanted to kind of conclude by just talking about Energy UK's proposal for Eco Plus. So we published a report last year called Eco Plus just before we had the consultation. It was a slightly different kind of proposal to the 3-year obligation that Kirsty described. So while we called for fully funded measures for those who couldn't afford insulation, we kind of felt that there was a need to also have a kind of wider offer for, again, those consumers who don't fall into the eligibility but still need some support. So things like kind of partial subsidies, such as like 50% contribution from government towards the cost of measures, and then you would start to stimulate some behaviour change as well. And suppliers are really well placed to kind of offer bundled services in a way as well. So bringing together the boiler upgrade scheme, installing a smart meter, potentially offering a time of use tariff, and starting to move towards that whole house offer that we're seeing in Eco4 among the wider wider consumer groups. So just to conclude in saying that Eco4 and Eco Plus have been really strongly welcomed by the industry, by Energy UK. They provide really vital support, but they need to be part of a bigger framework, a policy framework that's going to accelerate the transition among a wider consumer base. So really looking forward to your questions, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Louise. I completely agree on the points around sort of greater dialogue with local authorities. I think almost all of the sessions that I've been in at this conference have touched on data sharing and the importance of this for energy efficiency policy design and delivery. But I think the other side of that sort of collaboration of closer working relationships as well. And also touched on another key point around sort of collaboration between energy efficiency schemes, such as the boiler upgrade scheme. Thanks. So I will now pass over to James, who is going to talk about the experience of delivering eco from a contracting agent's perspective.
Thank you very much. Well, happy birthday to eco. I think it's been 10 years this month since eco was first launched, and Agility Eco is almost as old. We are eco managing agents, so we work with energy suppliers to help them achieve their obligations, but we also run other schemes that blend eco with other funding for retrofit and energy efficiency across the country. We run a big energy advice scheme called LEAP, where we are supporting fuel poor households and referring them on for measures. And we do a lot in the surveying space, so the PAS 2035, the retrofit assessment and coordination that's required for eco measures. So we have a lot of perspectives on eco, and I suppose I'm going to try and bring some of those forward. And I really want to focus on a couple of themes, which is compromise and communication. And since I'm going to be speaking for lots of people today, I think, I'm going to have a bit of audience participation now, just quickly. So I would like you to raise your hands if you walked in here knowing loads about Eco4. If you self-identify as that. Wow, not many. Okay. More, that's it. Okay, get hands up right all the way up so I can see them. Brilliant. Okay, so not many people. How many people walked in here not knowing much at all about Eco4? So feeling kind of quite confused about the whole thing. Reasonable, maybe more, quite a lot more. Okay, thank you. Hands down. How about Eco Plus? How many people walked in here understanding what Eco Plus proposals are from the government? Hands right up so I can see them. Real minority. Okay, hands down. Thank you. How about if you knew nothing about Eco Plus really and we're hoping that we would explain it to you? Excellent, that's good. I think my fellow panellists have done an excellent job in that. So thank you for doing that. Any installers in here today doing eco measures? No, they're all out installing eco measures. There was one. Get out and install those eco measures. Don't listen to me. And any local authorities in here? Any council officers? That's good. Hands all the way up. Okay. And keep your hands up if you've published your statement of intent. Oh, well done you. Excellent. Good work on that. That's fantastic. And finally, hands up if you work for NEA. Great. Round of applause for NEA for such a fantastic conference. Yes. Suck up, suck up. Okay, okay. Thank you very much. So I'm not going to labour the point on some of the excellent points that Louise and Kirsty and Mark have made, but this is how I would like people to think of Eco4, and it's a compromise. So over 10 years, it's changed an awful lot. And as we've said, we're really trying to achieve an awful lot now with Eco4. We're trying to find the right kind of households who are of low income. We're trying to find the right properties, so treating the worst properties first, get multiple SAP band increases on those properties. We want the right measures in. We want to do insulation first, fabric first. We want it to be low carbon. We want low carbon heating going in. We want to have all the proper assessment stuff. We want a retrofit coordinator to produce a plan for the property for the long term. And then with all of that, you've got to think as well that actually practically you've got to have installers who are able to do that work, who want to do that work, with whom it's economically advantageous to do that, that aren't competing against other schemes like HUG, for example, which also want those kind of properties and those kind of households. So really, absolutely, Eco4 is a struggle at the moment to deliver. And you might have seen this graph before. Don't worry about reading the words, but just sort of look at the bars. This is 10 years of eco delivery, and you can see right in the right-hand corner, that's Eco4. So the number of households that are being supported at the moment is very, very small. And it's true that they're getting a really great outcome in terms of the multi-measure improvement to their home, taking them right out of fuel poverty, a massive life-changing experience. But that is not going to help the millions and millions of people who need help. So there's got to be some thought as to what's going to happen there. And I guess this is another way of showing the same thing. So these are all the BEI's monthly statistics they publish on their site, really useful. Again, don't worry about the words, but this is the last year of eco delivery. You can see that Eco3 ended halfway up there, the last day. This is like per day, the measures that were submitted. The very last day, absolutely loads of people submitted their measures. Then there was a short transition for 3 months, and then you can see the last 6 months, the delivery is slowly being edging up, but we're not getting there yet. We are getting there bit by bit, but hopefully, Eco Plus is going to provide a good solution in terms of supporting more households who need help now. And this is how I would compare Eco Plus to Eco4. The same stages, but each time you're not ejecting so many people because you've got a much broader criteria for financial eligibility. So that council tax band, that's proxy for people's income. That's going to be about 85% of households across Britain. For 80% of the funding, that's the proposal in the consultation. I know NEA would like to see more focus on fuel poor households, which is a fair argument, but I think the majority of the money is going to be going towards people I might well be eligible for Eco Plus. Then we're looking at the right kind of property. There isn't that SAP band requirement to improve. A single measure goes in. D-rated properties, so a lot of D-rated properties out there, they are not going to be penalised. They will be eligible. Then thinking about the right measures going in, so it's insulation, but there might not be such a push towards having a full survey with the retrofit assessor and the medium-term plan. Again, it might be using Trustmark's new Licence Plus approach, which is still of good standard, but it's not as costly, it's not as onerous. And then finally, for the feedback that we have from the installers that we work with, so there's about 70 or 80 installers across the country that we work with on different schemes. Some are huge, some are really tiny, but the general feeling is that, yes, this is a good idea. There is spare capacity at the moment with people going out in vans with loft insulation, with cavity wall insulation, and they'll get it in there. So great for Eco Plus. And I guess Eco Plus is also a compromise because it's not focused on fuel poor households. More households who potentially could pay will benefit, but then again, it's going to be impossible, I think, to really achieve everything that we want to. And I think that just, if I may, thinking about the title of this session around the decarbonisation of fuel poor homes, I take a little bit of umbrage with that because I don't think that the focus of Eco should be around decarbonisation. I don't think we should think of it that way. I think we should be thinking of Eco as a focus on supporting fuel poor homes so that they can live well in their properties, they can have warm homes, and they can have all of those positive benefits of a warm and healthy home. I think if there's decarbonisation that comes from it, that's a good secondary outcome. But the reality is that people like me, who live in larger homes, who are not fuel poor, who can afford to heat, I can afford to heat my home to a nice warm level, I'm the one pumping out the carbon, let alone the other things that I do, like drive a car or take a flight, or things that fuel poor households might have difficulty in doing. It's me that needs to be decarbonising more than fuel poor households. And I don't think that we should be too swift to start pushing, for example, and this is a big debate, not for now, I haven't got time, electrification of heat too hard on fuel poor households, when again, I can go out and buy a gas boiler and do what I want with it. So anyway, I digress, but I think it's a bit tricky to achieve everything. So again, compromise. Okay, I've got just a couple of minutes left. I wanted to just raise a few positives, I guess, thinking about Eco4 and the delivery going forward and how we're going to make it easier to get that money spent and those people helped. We've talked about EcoFlex. I think there's a view that maybe local authorities are slow to get their statement of intent published, and it's true. But I think there are reasons for it. I think those of us who don't work in councils forget that a council might be gigantic, but usually it's one person at that council or a couple of people who know what the hell's going on with this agenda, and they've got a load of other things to do, and most of those are statutory, and EcoFlex isn't. And then there's an awful lot of people saying, oh, but what about the risk? What if we get complaints? What about the quality assurance? It's, there's a lot to go through for council to feel comfortable to get involved with the retrofit of homes. So it's up to us, working in other sectors, who can maybe come forward and say, hey, this is how we can help you. It won't cost you anything. We'll de-risk it for you. This is the way to go. And I really appreciate the kind of partnership approach to it, to say, let's make more homes eco-eligible. And you might have seen just before Christmas as well, the new Route 4 guidance has come out from the government around the kind of area-based use of flex. So again, it's a little bit difficult to imagine how it might work, but it would be great to be getting area-based schemes where you're targeting all the properties in a particular neighbourhood and everyone's getting something. And I think Eco Plus will help with that because, again, you can, it's not quite as good as the full gold standard Eco 4 retrofit, but people are getting something. Or even if it's energy advice or fuel vouchers or something, then there's a support for a whole community there, not just for individual pepper-potted households. Just looking on the top right there, we've been waiting for a couple of years for the minimum energy efficiency standards response from the government to the consultation and an increase in the standards, the stick that especially, again, councils can beat landlords with, no offence landlords, but some of them do need that push, and Eco then provides a carrot to support them in meeting those obligations. So hopefully the government will get around to responding to that soon. And quite exciting, I think, changes, I don't know the full details really, but my colleagues tell me, the changes to the SAP regime. So you'll probably know that SAP 10.2 now, I think, is the latest version of it that was published last year, which underpins EPCs, the RD SAP process. The data that was being used for that was about 10 years old. It still is because we haven't implemented it into EPCs yet. And so there's exciting stuff coming on the horizon. Maybe later this year, probably next year, but where we'll be able to do things, for example, like take into account the use of batteries in helping to homes to keep energy that they either generate or they can do through getting energy when it's cheap at night and using it during peak times. So to be able to fund, for example, solar and battery under ECO or HUG, other programs like that, is going to provide a great solution for households that might not be suitable for an air source heat pump or external wall insulation. So that will be really good to see RD SAP 10.2 coming in. And then finally, I guess just thinking about communication again, low carbon heating, there's Fred, one of the guys from our schemes who's got an air source heat pump. He's happy with it. I think a lot of people aren't happy with the idea of getting a heat pump. I think there needs to be some excellent communication from all of us around the electrification of heat, and also some of the toxicity that I see in debates on LinkedIn and Twitter. We need to chill out a little bit. So I think, I've kind of suggested heat pumps are magic, they're fantastic, but not for everybody and not necessarily for fuel-poor homes first. And it's good to see as well in the sort of snuck into the Eco Plus consultation some changes around, for example, making Eco 4 allowing households with panel heaters to have high heat retention electric storage heaters, or confirming that if you're putting solar panels on the roof, then electric heating will be renewable heating. So again, alternatives to air source heat pumps for properties that might not be suitable for them, which will be really welcome. So I think hopefully some positives to end on there from quite a negative start. I know that the graph wasn't looking great, but I think we're going to get there, and we'll definitely get there together. So thank you very much.
Thank you, James. I think those pyramids are a really brilliant way of sort of visualising eco schemes. And also it's a really interesting discussion around where the burden lies with decarbonisation. I completely agree that the financial burden should definitely not fall on fuel-poor homes who already sort of pay a premium despite being less placed to. We'll go to the wider Q&A in a minute and the Slido question, but I just had a question for James first. So it does refer back to that kind of doom graph at the beginning. Why do you think that Eco 4 is under-delivering in comparison to its sort of previous iterations?
So I think it's down to that complexity, and I didn't probably give enough shout out to installers for how they've had to try and deal with the situation. And colleagues on the panel mentioned as well just that the sheer amount of paperwork, the bureaucracy, and the risk that needs to be taken to confirm a household as being eligible and to get paid for the work that's to be done. And so many properties, it's common sense sort of dictates that they need to be helped. And, I do have conversations with installers about this, that, people ring them up, they go around to someone's home, we know that they need help, and there are millions of people like that. Then the installer can see, we can see that they need some measures, that something could be done to help that property. But then you've got to work out, does it meet the calculations? Is there enough money available? And Kirsty, you made a great point about ancillary works. Often the worst first properties, they're not just worst in terms of lack of insulation, they're worse in terms of they are falling down. And you can't just shove some measures in and hope for the best. You've got to repair that property. So all of those things, I think, make it really difficult to engage. And the other thing I mentioned briefly was the competition with other schemes. So if you've got hundreds of millions of pounds being sloshed around for LAD and HUG, and shortly SHDF is coming round as well. It's all wanting the same supply chain, all the same, really well-trained staff. There's just not enough people, there's not enough kit, and companies will choose the route that offers them the least risk, so that they can pay their staff and they can not go under. And eco, there's rewards potentially for the best properties, but there's also a huge amount of risk as well. So I think all of those reasons, that's why it's been quite slow.
Thank you. And Kirsty, you also touched on some of the challenges around Eco 4. Do you have any thoughts on that question about why Eco 4 may be under-delivering compared to sort of previous counterparts?
I think, is this working? Yeah. I think it comes back to that point. I can't look at you and talk into the microphone, so apologies. I'll look the opposite direction and talking. I think it does come back to that point that, that graph that James showed was in terms of homes that were supported. There has been a very slow start to Eco 4. We are almost a year into it, but actually legislation was very delayed, guidance was very delayed, and actually I would say probably only really got off the ground in earnest over kind of the autumn-winter period. And it has been a slow, steady start because the installers, as James was just saying, have had to learn to adapt, and we're only really just seeing the supply chain adapt to what is needed for Eco 4. And then we have that other point where we are going to see less homes supported through Eco4 than previous schemes because there is a greater cost per home to be treated. So it's not just one measure that we're doing. We are doing, 4 or 5 5 measures in a home.
Thank you. So I'm just going to get the answers to the Slido question up next. If that's okay. Thank you. So, okay. Thank you. So let's go with the first one. So this is referring to EcoFlex, especially Route 3 referrals from health professionals, working out the process for getting letters from GP practices without incurring a charge for the householder. Yeah, definitely reflect on that. All the quick wins are gone, fearful of promoting one installer for concerns of bad work. And then we have one directed here to James. So James rightly mentions that retrofitting homes is not a statutory duty for local authorities. Should it be, with the relevant budgets in place to enable them to do so? James?
Thank you. Well, I definitely think that there needs to be more support and more duty on the private rented sector, and for local authorities to do what they should do, and for English local authorities to have the same information and powers as the devolved government authorities to know what every landlord's, what the EPC of every property that is out there, and to have the proper support to be able to enforce that legislation. That seems to me to be a massive hole, and it's just been going on for years. I don't think the MEES legislation and the implementation of it over the last 5 years has really gone anywhere. It doesn't feel as if there's been, for the landlords who, the bad landlords, because there's many good landlords. I don't mean to kind of do down landlords generally, and many of them are engaged in landlords forums, and they're trying their best, and they're doing their best for their tenants. But those are the ones who are easy to get hold of, and I think councils need more support in being able to regulate that sector.
Thank you. And then can I also go to Louise for this question, given you touched on sort of local authorities. Do you think that retrofitting homes should be statutory for local authorities?
It's a really interesting question, and I think, as I kind of touched on in my remarks, I think that increasingly the energy industry will need to work with local authorities to kind of set up local area energy infrastructure and ensure that consumers are really engaged in that process as well. So I'm not sure if I have a kind of direct response, but absolutely I think it's really important to start kind of building those relationships.
Completely agree, thank you. So I'll go to this comment here. So lack of resource within the local authority is a real challenge, both in terms of people to engage fully with the process and with energy companies, but also in developing the tools to identify homes and measures most in need. Why does ECO not allow local authorities some budget to pay for officers within the council to lead on ECO work? Pass to the panel for any questions. Mark?
It's a good question, and I come across lots of local authorities who, and it's been mentioned already on the panel and in the audience, I think, that there's just a lack. A lot of local authorities are quite stretched with lots of other things that are far more important on their to-do list. LA Flex might be quite close to the bottom. So to get energy officers employed, it would be great if that could be done under ECO, but it can't, can it? The ECO is what it is. The legislation's been laid. It's a really good question to perhaps put back in front of Ofgem and Bays. That would really help, I think, because we would love, as I said earlier, we'd love to work with more local authorities. Doing community schemes as opposed to individual homes is far more rewarding. It really is. When we can do estates, blocks of flats, it makes a huge difference to community. When we're doing individual homes, yes, of course, those individual homes are finding real benefits from what we're doing, but we'd much rather do it on a larger scale. So it's a really good question, one I haven't thought of, and something we should perhaps put back to Bays, NEA.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to this comment. Lack of access to benefits data is a missed opportunity to notify residents that they could be eligible. Kirsty, you touched on the use of data. Why is that not happening?
Well, yeah, I think that's our point at the moment. Each time that we have bilaterals or wider discussions with Bays, we are pushing for that data sharing to happen. It's written in the legislation. It's there as a mechanism that BEIs are due to establish with the DWP. We appreciate that there have been lots of pressures on DWP under kind of energy crisis and other schemes that they've had to jump to. We don't want to get to the end of Eco4 without this mechanism being in place, so it's something that we are continuing to push and ask for.
Thank you. I'll go to this question. So our procured contractors are reluctant or not interested in the project. How can we make it more attractive to our contractors? James, do you have thoughts on that?
So I wonder if is that a kind of an eco scheme that's been set up with a council that's appointed in principle an organisation to do that, or whether they're thinking about LAD and HUG and a scheme where they have control over it and they are the funder effectively. I mentioned before, I suppose, the conflict, the competition between eco and other schemes, and I think we need to sort that out. And the question before about, why can't councils have some eco? Well, that's what LAD and HUG is. Councils being given the opportunity to have money and to have a 15%, up to 15% of that to hire staff and surveyors and get the work done internally. And we've seen that there's a huge variation in councils' ability to do that, and lots of that money was bid for and allocated and then not spent again and again and again. And part of that has been down to some pretty tight timescales. I think government probably has got the right idea when they've given a 2-year period for HUG 2, and should probably go further than that. I think we probably all recognise that even 4 years for Eco 4 isn't ideal as well. We really want even longer, but politically, I'm not sure if that's possible. But still, local authorities, there's a huge variation in their capacity and ability to do that work. And so maybe there needs to be a recognition that retrofit is so complex that there needs to be partners working together and everyone should do what they do best. And there's no one organisation or agency that can do it all.
Thank you. So this comment here suggests linking up with teams who essentially looks like go into homes and ensure that they're free of standards under local authority statutory duties. And then the question underneath speaks about linking up with advice agencies. Louise, I know that you said in your presentation that something is worked on. Can you speak a little bit about the benefits that might arise from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just in terms of the kind of link I was trying to make to the consumer journey and how essential it is to make sure that that's a positive experience, especially in Eco Plus coming in next year. It's really important that it's really simple from the perspective of households. And I think more broadly, kind of tailored, specific consumer advice that's trustworthy and independent has a really vital role to play in empowering people to improve their home, really. And I know Citizens Advice has obviously kind of been speaking to this consistently. And I think, obviously, the government's kind of updated their online advice service, so they've got their home energy MOT service, but while you receive your plan, it doesn't necessarily convert into action because you're not necessarily linked to, your local authority for more information or a local provider of more information. And potentially kind of making that connection would help really, engage people and give them all the information they need to move forward. I guess the final thing I'd just say on Eco Plus is that in the government's consultation, they asked a question about the potential for customers to kind of go online or consumers to go online and see if they'd be able to get involved, which is would be quite a big departure, I guess, from how it currently works under Eco4 when it's very installer-led. So that's something that we're kind of speaking to government about how that might work at the moment, as it would obviously be a kind of new route for people to get involved.
Great, thank you. And then Kirsty, I know you touched on specific advice agencies that you work with. How does that enrich the work that you do? How does it sort of make it easier to deliver?
It's actually more work we do with those agencies where it's less to do with eco. It's actually where we're not able to support households with Eco4, but it's looking at what else can we do. It's that frontline response to energy crisis. It's doing what we can to really help the immediate issue whilst, and it doesn't mean that we can't support those households through those partnerships and not give them Eco4. We can absolutely do both. It's a two-pronged attack. It's that immediate response to an immediate issue that these householders have got, and then Eco4 or Eco Plus then becomes that long-term solution to actually trying to prevent the problem in the long term.
Thank you. So I'll go to some questions from the audience now. Does anyone have a question? Thank you, Juliet, here. Thanks. I think we have a roaming mic coming. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, everyone, for really insightful talks. I think, that graph was pretty shocking to see. And I think from an installer perspective, that it's huge impact on livelihoods, job turnover, all the rest of it. And I feel like there's a risk that if we do allow it to the numbers stay so low, we're going to lose some of that supply chain. And I'm just wondering what more energy companies can do, what more government can do, from the range of perspectives here. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I go to Mark on that question?
A difficult question to answer because we, EDF, we work with over 30 installers. Some are quite small regional ones, others are big national ones. There's one or two here at the conference. And they're all saying the same thing. Without sort of repeating what other people have said, it's hard because you've got to find these properties that qualify. And I think the more we can do on a community basis, i.e. encourage local authorities, like I've said before, to get more engaged with Eco4, that in itself I think might actually boost the actual retrofits that are done. So when you're doing lots and lots of measures on a tower block or in a community, then that will employ more people than just doing individual measures, or many measures, but on an individual property itself. So maybe that's the way we've got to look at it, and try and work in partnership with local authorities, with our installers, and try and get these schemes up and running as a consortium.
Thank you. Kirsty, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, I think one of the areas that concerns us is the fact that actually the supply chain does appear to have been shrinking. So if we compare the supply chain, if we go back to Eco1, back to 2012, and we look at the scale and the size of the supply chain that was available at that time, the number of installers that now operate in the eco space is far, far reduced. I think that's down to a number of things. There was an uplift in quality and standards, and that has had a good positive impact on some of the supply chain. But also, actually, the requirements of the scheme have become more and more onerous. If you compare it to predecessor schemes, to Eco, or even just Eco1, it has become much more complex. The customer journey is much more complex, and it is much more risky for householders. One of the things that we have been calling on as energy suppliers to both Ofgem and BEIS is actually to have more regular feedback from Ofgem on measures that are submitted throughout the scheme. We are often seeing feedback coming on those measures sometimes more than a year after those measures are submitted, and then having to go back to those installers and say, actually, there's an issue here, and can you help with that? And that's just not really sustainable for these installing companies. They need to know that actually the work has been done and everything's great, and that actually we're not going to come back. And some of this stuff is not their fault. We're not talking about major issues with the install, which of course they would have to address. We're talking about kind of minor admin anomalies that have been picked up, and then they're at risk of losing the measure. And so there's an awful lot more risk that has been built in throughout Eco as the schemes have progressed. So the legislation is in place and it's there. One of the things that we are saying from an Eco Plus perspective is keep it simple and keep it easy, and really ensure that new entrants are encouraged to come in and work on Eco. James has touched on the competition that's in the market at the moment with these schemes. There are different standards, different levels of evidence requirements, different admin complexities, and actually Eco is probably one of the most complex and difficult and risky, and so they are choosing to operate in other schemes. So I think there's a lot to be looked at in terms of simplicity of the scheme.
Thank you. And maybe we have one more time for an audience question. Yeah, just here.
Thank you, Simon Ross from March's Energy Agency. Yeah, there's a lot of complexity in all of this. We support householders who are struggling day in, day out with customer journey support on the HUGS Sustainable Warmth competition. And we're taking lots of calls about, explaining the process, gathering evidence, working with local communities, answering questions about why the surveyor hasn't turned up or why has there been a mess left post-install. So there's lots of stuff around that we're picking up to support people. And if they're not going through the schemes, then we're looking to navigate across to other programmes. So I've made a comment there about, under the LAD3 programme, there's hundreds of householders coming forward at local authority level. LAD3 finishes, for us, middle of February, probably in terms of new entrants to the programme. How are we going to support them? Because their expectations have been built up. Is there a movement across potentially to Eco4 there? And if the capital doesn't work, then we can help with a home visit or prepayment meter vouchers or billing issues or et cetera, et cetera. So it's not us, there are other charities in the room who can help as well. So it's an invitation to help.
Thank you. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
So LAD3 finishes end of March?
Well, they're still working it through. Probably end of June at this point. But in terms of new applicants to the system, we're looking middle of February is the steer we're getting at the moment.
Some of the feedback we get from our installers is that the LAD scheme's far easier to implement than it is Eco because there's less admin involved, it's simpler, and the local authorities like it because they know that they've got this pot of money to call off, whereas Eco, it's all with always the energy companies, it's the installers, it's all a bit distant perhaps. I don't know if there'll be a LAD4. I don't know if anyone knows the answer if there's going to be a LAD4. They seem to be successful, albeit I know it was mentioned earlier that some local authorities haven't spent all their money. And it's a real shame because it can make such a huge difference to communities, as I keep saying, I know. But I would like to think it won't end in LAD3, but I honestly don't know. Eco4 is more complicated than the LAD schemes, so you'd like to think that both can sort of work. Eco4 concentrating on lots and lots of measures being on one property, getting it up from like an F or a G all the way up to C or above even, great. LAD to me means that more work can be done in the local authorities area, so as in like the installers work on both, they are still quite different. So I think to have that choice for a local authority to still continue with LAD funding but look at Eco4 and see what we can do in that as well. It's probably the best of both worlds, really.
Yeah, thanks so much. Okay, I will let everyone have some time back for their lunch. And yeah, thank you all for a great panel, and thanks to all our panellists.